Hello, this is Porter, and today I'm going to look at this hand that I played against Persuadio in our online club game. For those of you that aren't familiar, we play 10 cent, 20 cent, but we typically play very deep. So in this hand, we're both about 500 big blinds effective. It's an unusual hand. We both took what are probably non-typical actions with the hands that we held, but I think it's interesting and illustrates some game theory concepts, some ideas about playing turns with significant depth, and some methods for looking at turn construction using GTO Plus. I'm also going to use some of the methods that I'll discuss in the webinar that I'm going to do in March about using GTO Plus, how to use it, and the methods that I think are most effective for studying and building strategies using GTO Plus. So I'll play the hand here in this hand to note hand history replayer here, and then we'll get into the analysis in GTO Plus after that. So this is a hand. This hand took place at the end of the session, so we're down to three-handed. I'm here on the button, and this is Persuadio here in the big blind. So I open to three big blinds, and then P calls, and we see this flop, this King 8-4 rainbow flop. P checks. I bet about 30% or 30% pot here, and he calls. The turn is the 5 of diamonds. P checks. I bet 130% pot here, and he raises to about 3x, just under 3x. And now I 3-bet to about 2.5 times the size of his check raise. He actually, it's not in this hand history, but he now goes into the tank for quite a bit and then jams. And I, of course, fold my jack high. So the main questions that I want to look at here mostly involve the turn play. The first one is, what happens if on the turn I bet small too often and then my turnover bets become too bottom heavy? So what I mean is I'm going to split my range on the turn, and some of my range is going to bet more like a 2/3 size, and then some of my range is going to overbet. But what happens if I'm making mistakes with my implementation there, and my small size is very merged and my big size is polarized, which is fine, but if I'm putting all of my bluffs into that big size and I don't have enough value in that turn overbet size, then that range becomes open to being exploited by turn check raises. So we'll look at that. Then as the imposition player on the turn, do I want to have many 3-bets when my overbet gets check raised, or do I want to skew towards mostly calling there and not 3-betting very often? It's not a spot that comes up very much unless you're playing really deep, because often when you get check raised on the turn there, you're just going to be your 3-bet size will just be all in, and it's easier to construct that sort of range than I think it is to have a 3-bet range that's not all in, which then opens you up to being jammed on. So then what if I think that P is going to check raise too frequently on the turn? What would that look like, and how would I want to implement a 3-bet range or a calling range when he does check raise too frequently? And yeah, then if he does check raise too often, what might I assume he is using for those frequent check raises? So the first thing I did was solve this flop for our effective stacks and the pot, and gave us both various betting options. And I have to make some assumptions here about what P's preflop range is going to look like when he defends the big blind. I don't know his strategy exactly, so I'm just making a best guess here that he's going to have some of this 7-6 offsuit and 3-bet, top end and some of these suited connectors, some of these suited aces. He might defend wider than this a bit, which will make his range a little bit weaker on the flop. He might have more of these 8x. He might have more 7-6 offsuit here. I'm going to make an adjustment for that on the turn and give him credit for having 7-6 maybe a little bit more often than this. He might check raise those on the flop a decent amount when they flop a gut shot like they do here, but just as an experiment, I'll show a turn where he has 7-6 more often to see how my strategy shifts there. But this is my best guess. And then for myself in position here, this is pretty much typical for what I would open the button with. Opening the button, my frequencies don't change three-handed. I don't think that there's an incentive to change frequencies just because you're short-handed. It's just the same as being the button in a normal game when it's unopened and it's on you. So those are my assumptions there. And then what I've done is I've got 4 different sims here. The EVs aren't probably 100% accurate because I'm only solving down to 3% because it's so deep here. So I wouldn't put too much stock in those. But the point here was first I solved to see what it would look like if this imposition button splits their range into 2 different sizes here. I think I gave it 30% and 70%, and this obviously a very complicated mixed strategy here. I don't assume that I'm going to implement this exactly like this. I'm not going to give myself that much credit, but I feel like I have a decent sense of how I would implement there. I also looked at this one flop size as if this player was to just only bet 30% or check. But I know that I bet big on this board. Sometimes I think there's an incentive when you're super deep like this to have some hands. You'll have some hands that want to use a larger sizing on this board. So then what I've done here is node locked what I think is my strategy. It looks, I think, like a more complicated mix than it probably is, but most of these hands have a clear reason for their action, and I think I'll implement something like this. You can see like betting middle set large more often, betting top set large sometimes, mixing with aces and ace king. I won't go too in depth for the reasons for all those, but I just node locked this on my own and then ran it, and it seems like it's decent, and I feel like it's an accurate representation of how I'm likely to play on this board. So then I want to look at turn spots. I can just continue to the turn in this simulation, this solve, and see how it plays, but I'm going to want to make a lot of different changes to the turn and see what the results are, and it's not going to be effective to do it within this file. So what I've done is exported the turn ranges. So when I bet small here and the turn is the 5 of diamonds, we get this strategy here. So what I've done is exported these ranges that arrive at the turn to Flopzilla. We can see what that looks like. So now we've got these ranges in Flopzilla here, and then I've exported those. I've copied and pasted from Flopzilla into another file here, and then ran solutions for this 5 of diamonds turn using different assumptions for both players here and gotten the results. So yeah, I guess like one other thing I can mention here is just on the flop, I'm making assumptions about what P will check raise and not going into the turn. You can see that 7-6, because when I export the ranges from GTO plus to Flopzilla and then back again to look at turns, I'm copying this range that check calls flop. So I need to make assumptions about is P going to play this perfect equilibrium strategy? Well, probably not, but I think he'll play something like it, and I don't have a strong opinion on saying, well, he's not going to do this ever, or he's always going to do something else. So I think he'll play reasonably like this, and so I'm just going to use this check call range here when I export everything into the turn. So I've exported those ranges that arrive at the turn into this separate file here. This is just essentially what they call a subtree in PO. And then I've ran a bunch of different simulations with different assumptions on the turn so that I can answer those questions that I showed earlier in the video. One thing that I think is worth mentioning here is the overbet on the turn. So two ranges here exported from GTO Plus into Flopzilla Pro, and the turn is input here as well. These are the ranges that arrive at the turn after that small bet by imposition on the flop. You can see here in the equity graph that imposition has a fairly significant top end advantage, but they also have a slight equity disadvantage for overall ranges. And what that does is give the imposition player an incentive to polarize, and they're going to do that by making large bets. The very strong hands in this player's range have an incentive to build the pot. They want to play for stacks, or at least a significant portion of stacks. And their bluffs, because a wider range for out of position has been retained through that small flop bet, the bluffs also have an ability to start polarizing here in order to get folds on the turn or the river, whether it's through a large river bet or a river overbet when the turn goes check call. So I think it's pretty clear from this that there is an incentive to overbet the turn. You could possibly play a strategy that did not include turn overbets, but you'd want to construct your flop range differently. And yeah, just in general, I think when playing with really deep stacks, there's an incentive to have a large betting range, whether you're just going to start on the flop with a large bet and then play a more protected checking strategy, or if you're going to have some small bets on the flop, to then definitely have overbetting ranges for the turn and river. So we'll move on from here. All right, so this is a summary of all the different turn solutions that I've run. First, I just have the baseline equilibrium strategy for both of us when we arrive at the turn with the combinations that I've exported from Flopzilla Plus or Flopzilla Pro. Then I've got one where I've just node locked my strategy for overbetting the turn and using the small sizing on the turn, and look at what the response to that is from P. Then I've got one where I've node locked basically done a more thorough job and node locked my turn strategy plus the 3-betting strategy when check raised. I've got one here where I give P credit for having more combinations of 6-7 that arrive at the turn, and looking at how that changes my strategy. So you can see that my equity goes down here and my EV as well when he's got more combinations of the nuts. I actually gave him more combinations of sets in that version as well, so he has a little bit more 4-4 and 8-8 that don't check raise flop. This is an example that just shows what happens if your turn overbetting range does not have enough low equity hands in it. If you're just using overbets with sets, straights, maybe overpairs, some ace king, and then high equity draws, what does that do to the response for out of position? I've got one where I've node locked my base strategy, the turn overbet range, plus how I think P will respond to that. Then I've got one where I'm just node locking, and that includes node locking my three betting strategy. This one I've unlocked my three bet strategy, but left Chris uh, in a node lock for my assumptions, and then in this one I've adjusted to see what it looks like to answer one of my questions. What it looks like if Chris is check raising at an even higher frequency here on the turn. And then this is just this is how my given strategy will fare and adjust versus on the three bet versus the high frequency check raise. And then this is the equilibrium strategy before and after the high frequency check raise. So if it knows that the turn is going to be check raised at a really high frequency, it'll adjust in the earlier nodes for the overbetting, and it's going to funnel combinations into that turn bet that want to get check raised, and then have the ability to three bet or call after that high frequency check raise. So I looked at that as well. So now we can examine these, and I'll talk about how the strategies shift, how I might play, how I think P will play. All right, so first I'll look at really the simplest option here that shows why you need some low equity hands in your turn overbetting range, which is this overbet too strong solution here. So this strategy is betting the smaller sizing at a higher frequency. Really, they could likely add some bluffs into this small bet sizing. Their turn betting strategy, though, is mostly strong hands. They've got some high equity bluffs here, the flush draws mostly. I've left a couple low equity bluffs in there with ace 7 and 10-7 and 10-6. These other ones are all strong draws or sets or straights. So when this player does overbet here, this out of position player is, for the most part, just folding. This solution still assumes that this player is going to play perfectly on later nodes, but you can see that they're getting exploited here by just this player adjusts by overfolding significantly and only calling with about 18% of their hands. Doesn't change the EV of this strategy that much because this node is only occurring a little over 9% of the time. But in order for this out of position player to have any incentive to call or defend this against this overbet, this player needs to be overbetting a lot more often and with some low equity hands, as we'll see in the equilibrium solution here. So this is not the strategy that I'm going to assume that I play, but just at equilibrium on the 5 of diamonds turn, when this player bets 130% of pot, you can see this player is still not calling very often. They're only defending 41% of the time against this overbet, but significantly more than in that other option. And they're only raising 1.5% of the time. This is not going to be the strategy that I assume for P either. We know he raised, so he does have a raising range in this spot, but I think it's going to be a decent bit more than 1.5%. We can look at this range a little bit more, but you can see it's got a lot of low equity hands with 20% or less, like Queen 6 of clubs, spades, and hearts. Similarly with the Jack 6, Jack 7. These hands all have equity because they have a gut shot. They also block 7-6. They also block some of the bluff catchers in out of positions range, like King 10, King Jack, King Queen. You can see all those are there, and they're all very low EV calls against this overbet. Not zero EV, but fairly low EV. So those are those stronger bluff catchers. Like not exactly the worst bluff catchers in this range, but the relatively weaker bluff catchers in this range. There's an incentive to block those hands when you're overbetting and choosing low equity hands for the overbets. So I've taken this and then just adjusted it for how I think I would play the turn overbet spot. So that's what we've got here. I've got these hands, some of these low equity hands at a higher frequency. I think I'll use the overbet there quite often with those. Less so slightly with the 10x combinations, although I'm still overbetting all of the combinations of 10-6 and 10-7 that I arrive at this spot with. For the strong hands, I don't have any eights here because I use those in my large bet on the flop, so there aren't any here on the turn after I've bet small. I do have fives and fours overbetting, as well as king 8 suited, but not king 8 off. I've got some combinations of aces in the overbet, some high equity draws as well, some nut flush draws, and flush draws here, and then some of these offsuit aces that share properties with these combinations here, and some of the small gut shots to the bottom end there. So I've node locked that, and you can see here the way the solution plays now is to never raise turn, but to call quite a bit, because it's possible I have too many bluffs in this range, but it's choosing it, and it's assuming that I'm going to play perfectly when it does raise. So it's not finding EV there, but it is finding EV with a call and then playing out of position on the river. It knows it's going to be clairvoyant, so it can play perfectly on all rivers. And so that might not be a strategy that P chooses to implement, especially if he thinks that I will make mistakes facing a turn check raise, or that he thinks he can't implement this strategy perfectly, but he can do something else, and that will get me to make mistakes either on the turn or the river. So the next one we'll look at here is my strategy plus a response, which response, I just mean like I've also node locked what I'll 3-bet here when facing a check raise. And because of what I've node locked for myself in this spot, it's gone back and adjusted the earlier node to now raise this spot to check raise more often in order to get to this spot where I'm making some mistakes. So I've got myself 3-betting here, as I did with Jack 6 of clubs, some Jack 7 of clubs, Queen 7 and Queen 6 of clubs. Sometimes with these Ace-6 and Ace-7 of diamonds, sometimes with 8-7 of clubs, mostly 3-betting with the nuts, and occasionally with sets. So when I'm going to do this, it's going to go back here to this earlier node and raise somewhat more. So it's got some 8-7, some 7-6. It's raising with the nuts more often. You can see in this solution, I'm still not giving P credit for having much 7-6 here, or really any 8s, just some 5s, and so we'll adjust this. But yeah, I've also adjusted this later node here. So if I adjust this, so for P in this spot, once he check raises and I 3-bet, now it's jamming 7-6 only, essentially. No bluffs, and then just calling with the best diamond draws here that also have straight draws, this top 2 with the flush draw, sets. When it has 7-7 here, it'll be really low frequency. Everything's pretty low frequency there. And then I've node locked my strategy to call with this A7, A6, King 8, 7-6, 5s and 4s. So that's why it's not bluffing, because I'm calling too often in this spot, according to the solution. So we can see in these solutions that I've looked at, this out of position strategy is not check raising very often, mainly because it does not have very many strong hands that can support a check raising range. But P did check raise. So, I mean, a couple things are possible. One, he has more 7-6 and more sets than I'm assuming. Or two, he's check raising too often, despite the fact that he doesn't have many strong hands. I think it's more likely of those two that he does actually have more 7-6 and more sets here, and that he's not just check raising unprotected without those combinations. So I've built another solution here where I've just gone in and changed the range for out of position and added some more strong hands. So I'll pull that one up, and I've used this this secondary range more often. As you can see, the lower equity options here, all these with 46.51 equity for IP, are where this out of position range has more combinations of strong hands. You can see here I've given, he's got about a quarter of the combination, all combinations of 7-6, and then now more combinations of 4-4 and 8-8. I think I'm on the right one here. Let's see how many were in the base solution here for out of position. Only had, yeah, like less than 10% of the combinations here. Only 3% of the combinations of 8-8, and almost no combinations of 4-4. So yeah, I've adjusted those pretty significantly. I'm not going to assume that he has all of them because they mostly have an incentive to check raise the flop. So now you can see that this range is going to check raise quite a bit more, up to 5% or a little over 5% here. Check raising quite a bit with 7-6, some with 5-5, and then some of these high equity draws, some of this King X with the combinations that block straights and have a gut shot, some low equity combinations here with 4X, which blocks sets, and some of these combinations here that also block turn sets, and probably also block some hands that I can continue with against a check raise. So then I've still got this strategy locked here, and then you can see this range. Now, again, mostly jams the strong combinations because of how it doesn't bluff, because of how often I'm calling and how strong this range here is assumed to be. All right, so now we can look at a solution where I've node locked a strategy that I think might be representative of the way that P plays. An even higher check raising frequency here, I think, is reasonable for the out of position player because of how difficult it will be to play rivers and the possibility that I make some mistakes against check raise. So in this strategy, I've got check raising some combinations of 7s and 6s. For obvious reasons, they both have equity and block the nuts. More check raising more often with these combinations of the nuts. About similar frequency. I think I did not make a change to 5s there, so check raising 5 some, and then some of these low equity hands that block the nuts and have equity, some flush draws that can check raise and possibly call a 3-bet or jam over a 3-bet. And I've left my strategy just locked here, so I didn't make any changes there. This portion of the tree is still relatively the same. But so then I'm wondering, if P does check raise with a range like this, how will it change my response at later parts of the tree here? So I've got that here. So he's check raising this same frequency here that I've node locked. And this goes to answering the question of, do I want a 3-bet range in this spot where I check, or P checks, I overbet, and now he check raises? Is there a good reason to have a 3-betting range here, or do I want to just call and play rivers in position? I think there's a good case for 3-betting here at a decent frequency, especially if he's going to check raise more often than equilibrium, and especially if it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be easy to play rivers even in position on this board when I just call. If I just call, what I'm likely to do, I think, is my range will be weighted towards diamond draws and then some 6x and 7x, most likely with pairs on the, 8-7, king-7, that sort of thing. Now on blanks, my range is likely to be pretty capped on the river. It opens up a spot for him to overbet rivers pretty frequently, and also to do some checking to me, putting me in a relatively bad spot where I have a lot of missed draws and am forced to try to balance a frequency of bluffing and just checking behind. So yeah, I think there's a good case for 3-betting, and the solution is, you can see against this raising range, even some strong draws like Queen Jack of Diamonds are folding. These combo draws here are 3-betting a decent amount, along with the nuts, some sets, and then some hands, these pair plus draw hands, some polarized raises, and some calls with these ace-x combinations. I don't think really that I'll be able to implement something exactly like this. I mean, that might be a case for calling a little bit more often. I'll look at some alternatives next. Before I get to the alternatives, just look at this comparison of the two strategies for 3-betting after my turn overbet gets check raised. This is the equilibrium strategy, and then this is the response, the 3-bet range, once I make assumptions for P's check raising strategy. So you can see between the two, there's not a big shift. This one's adding a bit more bluffs, I think, assuming that some of his check raises can't call 3-bets, with these hands here. Some more combinations of these hands here, some of the Queen Jack of Diamonds, and then it's actually calling more often with the nuts, forcing some of the weaker portion of his turn check raising range to play out of position, and also allowing this range to call a bit more often with the hands that have enough equity. But you can see that there's not a huge difference between the two strategies in this spot. So the next question that I want to answer is, what happens to, or what should happen to my strategy if P will check raise at an even higher frequency on the turn. So actually, I'll look at this one first. So this is node locked for my turn strategy. I overbet, and now I've got P check raising at an even higher frequency. So now he's check raising more of these 7s and 6s, always check raising the nuts, check raising more often with some of these 7-4, 6-4, 6-5, 7-5, these hands that this pair plus draw. Yeah, some of the diamond draws, occasionally 9s. This is left over from the equilibrium strategy, but it shouldn't change much. Some 2-pair. So what happens now to my strategy here for 3-betting? You can see now it's 3-betting an even higher frequency. Some of these same combinations here, it's really playing more 3-bet or fold, and calling has gone down quite a bit due to the draws with equity that are check raising, this hand is going to jam more often, but it's just calling with the sets to play rivers. Yeah, and then you can see when I've node locked this strategy here at this node, this range now is jamming sometimes with sevens, not with a 7 to diamonds, and then sometimes with 7-6, but it's calling here at a decent frequency using some of these combo draws now to jam with, and then calling very well. Yeah, calling, it looks like rarely, but the calls are not so rare. But it's calling with the sets and calling with some of these stronger hands like King 8, and then the hands with good equity. 8-7 here that's an interesting call, but you can see it does have decent amount of equity against my assumed 3-betting range. So then if I go to the equilibrium strategy versus this high check raise frequency, what it does is it adjusts. I've allowed it to adjust this early node, and now it funnels combinations into this node here to capitalize on the high check raise frequency. So it's now just overbetting or checking, and when it does overbet and gets check raised here, it actually adjusts by only calling, which I think is pretty interesting. I think as a human, it would be difficult to implement this, just only calling and then now playing rivers with this relatively wider range. But this is assuming that both players are going to play perfectly and with clairvoyance on the river. So I don't know that I would. It also, I mean, one thing is it also requires me to be absolutely confident that this is the strategy that P plays, and I'm not going to be confident, to that degree about that. I'll assume that he's going to play maybe in this direction, but not exactly like this. So I've got to balance that uncertainty when I try to implement a strategy. What I think I'm likely to do is just make a more conservative assumption about what P check raises with. So more often than the equilibrium strategy was, but not as often as that high assumption was where he was check raising 12%, but something closer to this. And then try to play something like this strategy. There's a few like fractions of some of these low equity hands, using maybe more of these here, and some of these ace X combinations are used fractionally as well. Occasionally calling with just 7-6 without the flush draw, and using some of these as calls or bluffs as well, and then mostly calling with sets. I think that's what I'm generally likely to do. And then you can see this is how this is just an unlocked equilibrium for him, unlocked strategy for him after this node locked check raise. And you can see that he uses some of these sevens, some of these 7-6 combinations, some of these 7x combo draws. In fact, what he had in this spot, I believe, what the combination that he showed me was, or he didn't show during the hand, but later on, 7 of spades, 7 of hearts. So you can see that does work there pretty well and is used sometimes in this spot. And then in my spot, once that jam goes in, just defending with King 8 of diamonds, 7-6, I think I'm likely to call here with 4s, whether it's good or not. And yeah, so the point really is to understand the incentives and how your strategy will adapt based on what occurs at equilibrium, and then what occurs when your opponent makes certain shifts in their strategy. So I'm not going to draw any conclusions here about, well, I should play like this or he's making a mistake, but it's more for me studying these spots is about looking at the incentives, how different combinations can function when they're in a calling range or a raising range, and then how a calling range will be protected when you raise more or less frequently. It's not really about doing X is wrong and Y is correct, but what's our strategy and how do we maximize our EV based on how we believe our opponent will respond. I mean, one, I think the naive way to study is to just plug in ranges, plug in a board and bet sizing options, and then look at your combination and see how it played, and then say, well, Jack six of clubs was in an overbet 3-bet range in some of these solutions, so therefore I played it correctly. That's not going to really get you anywhere, but toggling these options and seeing how combinations function and how frequencies for each player can shift the strategies will be much more useful. And the other thing that you would want to do is not really just study this 5 of diamonds turn in isolation, but to compare it to other spots so you can generalize your strategy. So, like, what about the 5 of diamond? How is the 5 of diamonds going to be different from a turn 5 of hearts or turn 5 of spades or a turn 5 of clubs? So I looked at that, and then we got the strategies for each one here, and they do change a little bit. The diamond and the heart are played almost identically. The spade, which then is the same as the top card, and therefore in position and out of position, can no longer have, like on this board and this board, both players can have king X of diamonds or king X of hearts. That's no longer possible on this board. So in position ends up betting merged a little bit less frequently and betting polarized a little bit more frequently, but also checking quite a bit more. And then on the 5 of clubs, which does not add a flush draw, now we've got a Badoogie board. This imposition is incentivized to polarize much more frequently than on any of these 3 boards, and to use the merge sizing even less frequently. They overbet quite a bit just because it's much more difficult for out of position to continue when the turn does not add any draws to their range and adds few strong hands to their range. So on this, really only adds 4-5, 5s, and 7-6, or maybe some king 5 are the only improved hands for out of position on this board, and without the improved equity of adding some draws to the out of position ranges. Ace high calls, this turn is going to be more difficult, and therefore there's more of an incentive for imposition to polarize more frequently. The other thing that you'd want to do is say, what is the difference between how I'll play on a turn 5 of diamonds versus a 6 of diamonds versus a 7 of diamonds? So we can see that here, and imposition is now using some of these same combinations for polarization. They're not going to use this middle pair hand here. They're going to realize their equity with that. But now, because the 5 gives this player a gut shot and a blocker to 5-7, they're going to use that more to polarize. So really, we could take this and we could generalize it and say, well, how am I going to play king 8-4 or similar? I mean, like queen 7-3 is probably going to function relatively similar, and we can generalize and kind of come up with a strategy for how we're going to play these low turn cards that add a straight and some 2 pairs. How we'll construct our range in those spots. So that's it. I'll expand on that quite a bit, and on those methods and those strategies for construction that you can for how you can use Flopzilla Pro and GTO Plus together in the webinar. But hopefully that is an interesting taste of what I'll be looking at in my webinar. All right, thanks.